Hello, I'm Dr. Brian Fraser, and in this tutorial we'll see how to create our own settings activity. So this would be something we'd created. You'll see here how we can pull this value from this 15 from a shared preferences, and here is my settings activity that I can select what I want it to be. The basic demo is now when I close this, it went to 25. I'll come back to it here, and we can see that it then captures that value. So this is being loaded from a second activity, my options activity, and being saved through shared preferences. As a starting point for this, I'm going to pick up where I left off from the radio button tutorial with a few added features I've put in just to speed along this demo. So to start with, the last tutorial, which is linked below, left us off with a set of radio buttons which we could click on and it would then respond to. I've also stripped out a button and so forth down here to simplify it. What I've now done is I've added a first activity like this that has a bunch of text views and a show options button. So the idea is going to be that we're going to click on show options, we're going to select how many solar panels we want, like 50, and then we'll go back to the main activity and it will tell us you've selected 50 solar panels at a cost of, and we'll do some basic math to put in something for a cost. The whole idea is that when we restart our application, we want that value to be saved between executions of my application. So we're building the settings panel. Now before I get into much more detail on that, there is a settings class in Android that you can begin to use for activities that gives you the standard sort of settings feel. This tutorial is building a custom one using sort of standard Java or standard Android user interface elements and so forth, rather than the built-in settings activity. So if you want to make your application seem like a regular Android activity, then using this settings dialog as shown here, this URL at the top. But if you want to go through the process of building your own, then that's what we're going to do here. So let me just show you the code that I've got. I've got the main activity, my new main activity, with the 5 different text views shown here. Each of these 2 on the right has been given an ID, so num panels installed and solar panel cost. So I can use these from my code when I need it. I've also put in this show options button, which another tutorial linked below will tell you how to create another activity and then linked to it. Now the basics are, I've got my setup options button code here. It then finds my button, sets the on-click listener, creates an intent, and then starts the activity based on that intent. And I'm using the approach of, rather than building the intent myself right here, I'm going to have the activity I'm calling, or I'm starting, build me the intent. And so over here, the biggest change I've done to the options activity so far is I just added in this static method to make an intent, very much like a static factory method. The rest of the code is pretty much unchanged. The one interesting factor of how I'm getting the data into the options, if we look at this code here, is I'm getting a resource. And so the resource I've got is now a little off the screen. So I've created a resource file down here on the left, the installation size, and it's an array of integers. At the end we'll see I can just add something into here, and the whole application scales very quickly to new data coming in. So let's now start off with working on our actual settings activity. What I want to do is, when I click on a button, so this creates my radio buttons. We're doing the creation inside of my Java code. I'm going to, down here, we're going to say new radio button. And then I set up an on-click listener. And so this here creates my radio button that shows up on my user interface. So it creates each of these from the code. In response to me clicking on one of these, what I want it to do is store, using shared preferences, the value that it was clicked on. So not the text or the ID, but the number 25, for example, because that's what I really want to know. So I'm going to start by kind of putting the code in here. So effectively we want to say something like save num panels installed. And I want to pass in however many panels are now installed. And so that number we can see is up here, this num panel. So let's go ahead and create this method. I'm going to move my cursor onto it and hit Alt-Enter, and it will then create method. And I get to pick, because I'm currently inside of an anonymous class, do I want it to be inside my anonymous or do I want it to be outside? And I want it to be out. I want it to be as a member of the options activity. Void's fine, int's good, numPanel sounds good. Now I want to save the value into the options or the shared preferences. Now to do that, I need an instance of the shared preferences, so I can say shared preferences. I'm going to call this one prefs equals, I have to, based on some context, gain access to that. Well, I'm in an activity, so I can just use this. So I can say this dot get preferences, get shared preferences, or I could just say just get preferences directly. I'll put in the this to make it explicit that I'm on the activity. Now note, you could use the get preferences. I'm going to use the get shared preferences. Get preferences is specific to an activity, which we'll see later on is not going to be so useful in some cases. The shared preferences is for the whole application, and so that's better for me. I now need to give it a string. The name is the sort of the set of preferences I'm looking at. So I'm going to put in here something like app preferences. App prefs sounds good. Any string is fine. And then on the mode, I'm going to make this private. I don't need any other activities, or applications rather, looking at it. So then in order for me to write a value, I need to open up the shared preferences. So shared preferences dot editor. So give me an editor. I'm going to call it editor equals, I can say prefs dot edit. And it'll give me back an editor I can work with. I'm going to, into the editor dot, I'm going to put a integer, and this is going to give me a key value. So I need to put in some string, which is going to act as my key. So I'm going to call this one num installed panels. I can put any text here again just to make it unique would be fine. And then the value. And my value is the num panels. And finally, a very common mistake is forgetting to close it. So I'm going to do an editor dot apply. And that's going to apply the changes and save the changes. Now if I were to run the code, we'd see no difference, because all I'm ever doing is I'm saving the value. So, well, let's just run it and prove that it actually does not yet crash. The next thing I'm going to need to do is, so I'll click on this, and I'll click on any one of these. And if I had a way of inspecting what was saved, we can now go and check that, but we don't yet. So let's go and write some code that will now allow us to read that this shared preferences. Now I'm going to do something that may seem a little funny to start with. I'm going to make a public method, and I'm going to call this one, let's just call it get num panels installed. Again, we're kind of talking about solar panels. Here is our toy application, and it's going to return an int. And so I'm going to want to be able to call this method anywhere in my program and get the number of installed solar panels. Now in order for any other activity to call this activity, I would need an instance to call it on. But I don't want to have to use an instance, so I'm going to go static, meaning any other activity can call this, but now I can no longer access features of the options activity, so I'm going to need to pass in some context. This will allow me to gain access to a shared preferences object. So here again I need a shared access to a shared preferences object. Prefs equals, I can't use this here because I'm in a static method, so that I can't access this, but I can access context. Whomever calls this method must pass in a reference to their activity. And we'll see how to use it in just a moment. So context dot, I'm going to say get shared preferences. I need to put in the identical string I did before, app prefs, and again I want mode private. Now once I've got it, it's actually easier to get out the value than it was to put it in. I can say prefs dot get int. I need to pass in three things here, or pardon me, two things. The first one is the key. It has to be identical as before, so I'm just going to copy and paste it for now. A better way to be make a static private string that we can use here, but this is fine. And then the next thing I need to do is put in a default value. So at the moment, I'm going to put in a 0. We'll come back to this later and figure that out. So I'm going to put a to-do here. To-do change default value. We're going to be able to set the default in my XML data. We'll do that a bit later. And then the last thing I need to do, well, this returns me back an int, so I'm just going to return it. So now I've got a way to get this. Let's make it that when the activity starts up in onCreate, I'm going to say int saved value is equal to, get that. Now I need to pass in a parameter, remember? I need to pass it in some context. So I'm just going to pass it in this because my method is not a static method. So I'm already inside of an activity. And I can print it out. So let's just put up a let's put up a toast. Toast dot make text on this saved value is, and we're going to display, oops, saved value. I need to give it a duration of toast dot short, and we'll show it. Okay, so now what we're expecting is when the activity starts, it's going to put up a toast showing what value has been saved. And the way we save it is when you click on one of my radio buttons. Let's see if this all works. It'll come back to the main. We're going to say show here. It puts up a toast. It says saved value is 15 because we were actually clicking that from before, so that was great. I'm going to click 50. I'm going to go back. In fact, I could close the program entirely, and then I haven't given it a name, so let's just rerun it. Not sure which of my any of my applications it is. I'll come back over here, and now it remembers 50. So that's good. So it's actually saving it. I'm able to load it. I'm able to work with it. But I'm still not, I would like it to have this sort of set by default. So when the whole thing pops up, I'd like that one effectively selected to give me some visual feedback of what it is. So let's now work on that. So in here, back in my options activity, I've got the method to create the radio buttons. So in here, I want to somehow pick what's selected. So I'm going to put in some code down here. Select default button. So this is inside my loop, which is going through all of the possible panel size options. So it's iterating through these options shown on the right, which have been loaded into up here via the get resource get int array, and it's going into this array for me. So now I want to do is I want to check kind of, is this the default? So I can do something like, well, let's do it this way. If, well, the current value I'm working with is numPanel. If it's equal to get numPanels installed, I need to give it some context. I am inside my activity, so I can just say this. Basically, if the one that I'm currently putting up, like say, is it the 10 I'm putting up? If 10 was stored, then make it the default. And so to make it the default, I can simply put in here, I need on my radio button that I've got, so that's, I'm calling it my button, dot, and I'm going to say set checked. And I can pass in a parameter, true, to make this actually selected. So let's try that. Oh, let's actually close this back here. I'm going to restart. And now, when I go to it, it remains selected. If I go here, select 10, close, reopen, 10 is selected. It's not still selected. When I click back, it destroys the activity. It's that when I come to this new activity, that activity sets up its initial selection. And so it looks as though nothing has changed. So that's exactly the look I was looking for. Now, we've got the one last thing we want to do is actually make use of this. If this is my settings activity, I want the rest of the application to be able to use that information here. So let's code that to start, or code that next. We'll come back and do this, fix up my to-do down here after we've changed the main. So inside of main, let's remember what we're trying to do. I've got here my main activity. And what I want to do is I want to populate this text view here, which is my numPanels installed. And I want to populate that with whatever my options activity tells me. So I've already got it in my onCreate. I'm going to set up an options button. I'm now going to maybe set up, or let's go refresh screen. Because we'll end up calling this refresh. We're not just going to populate it once, we'll call it a few times. So I'm going to Alt-Enter to create the method. Void sounds good. And I'm going to move it down just so that the order inside of onCreate matches the order inside of my file. So in order to refresh the screen, I want to first refresh num panels display. Let's get in a reference to it. So text view TV num panels equals, we're going to cast a text view for find view by ID of the ID r.id dot, and I called that one num panels installed, I believe. Yep, num panels installed. On this, I want to set the text. Well, first I have to actually get that number. So the way I get the number is, let's go put it here as a variable. So num panels equals, I can say options activity dot, and because it's a static method, I can call it without needing an instance of the options activity. I can call it directly on the class. And so that's good. Now the one parameter I need to do is give it a context, which is an activity inherits from context, so I can just pass it in myself, this. And now we can set it. So I can say TV num panels dot set text. Now I want to be very careful here. These are all the different overloaded options I've got. There is one that takes in an ID down here, a resource ID, which is just an integer. I do not want to say num panels here. If I did that, it would treat that number, say the 50 panels, as a resource ID, which it absolutely isn't. So I need to make it a string, so I'm just going to do this. I'm going to say, easy way to do this is say no, an empty string concatenated with that turns it into a string. So let's try this to start with. I'm going to rerun this. And now it pops up saying here number selected is 10. If I change that number to say 25 and go back, we haven't yet updated it. But if I close the application and then relaunch, which I think is this one, yep, it actually sets that value. So we can see that we're accessing the shared preference value through my options activity, and we're changing it on the screen, and we're saving it between executions of my program. So a couple more things we might want to do. We might want to then set the number being displayed down here on the cost. Let's just multiply it by, say, 1,000. We'll say it's $1,000 a panel. And so that, if we go back over to here, we're going to see that that is going to be my solar panel cost. So we're going to set the cost here. I'm going to do a text view. We'll call it TV cost equals text view on find view by ID r.id dot solar panel cost. And I can say TV cost, let's put here int cost is equal to num panels times 1,000. I'd make that a constant, of course, but good enough. Dot set text. And here I'm going to pass in a string. I'm just going to put $sign and concatenate it with cost. Check that. It should now display a cost. Fantastic. And now the last thing I want to do is make it that when I go from the options menu, so let's say 50, and when I come back, I want this to update. So I could do that in a couple ways. I could do a start activity for result and so forth. One of the easiest ways, though, is going to be to override the one of the methods for the onResume. I suspect will do it for us. So my activity here is going to get an onResume when I return to it. So I'm going to override that. Let's go down here. I'm going to hit Alt-Insert to bring up the Generate Code menu. I'm going to select an overrided method, and I can start typing on resume. Resume. I don't want an on post resume, I want just an on resume. That one. So select on resume. It gives me the default implementation here. And the big thing I want to do is I want to update the screen. So I'm going to call refresh, just refresh my screen to redraw it. Let's try that. Rerun. It's at 50, I go back to 10. Now when I return here, it's updated correctly. So that's very nice. It now updates nicely for me. Now the one thing I wanted to do that we don't yet have is that default. It's kind of hard because we've been using it back and forth, and the values are already saved. But down here I put in a default value of 0, whereas sometimes you don't want it to come up as 0, kind of nothing selected. You want some valid input to be selected by default. So what I'm going to do is we're going to first, well, let's demonstrate what happens if I don't have something here. So I'm going to just change this. So I'm going to switch this string to num installed. Now realize that this is a different string than we had before, and so my shared preferences won't understand what it is. So when I run my program, it's not going to have any value here. It's going to hand me back the default, and so I get the 0. So what I did is I effectively said, no, I'm not looking for that previous value. I'm looking for a brand new one. I don't have any value there. If I went into show options, of course, here, let's just go see it. Nothing is selected. And that's not really the ideal behavior. So let's try and set this to some value. Now I could hard code this. I could say that, well, let's make it 10. But now I've got this kind of weird situation where my Java code is hard coding a value, and it kind of relates to these values stored here. So we're going to come into here and we're going to change the values, and we're going to put a default into here. So I'm going to say that I want to put in an integer, and I'm going to give it a name, and let's call this one default num solar panels. And then I need to give it a value, and so let's make it say 25, just to make it interesting. And I think that should do me. Now I want to here, instead of accessing this 10, I want to put in that 25 that I'm pulling from the resource XML. So let's pull that in. So I can pull that in much as I did before. So up here we saw that we could access it through this get resources. So I'm going to access it through get resources again. Now I'm inside of a static, so I have to do it on the context. So I can say context dot get resources, and here I want to get an int, just a straight up integer. Pass it in the ID. So this is going to be r.value, let's do this, r dot, and then I want to say value, or integer rather. It's an integer data type, and then I need to pick which one, so I want the default. It's the only one I've got. So int default equals this. Now I can't do default incidentally because default's a keyword in Java. So I'm going to say default value, and it will now pass me back the appropriate value there. And we'll set this here. So now we're going to pull in that default value when I rerun the program. This should now update, and we're selecting 25 by default. So without me making any selections, it comes up at 25. Okay, and a couple of last housekeeping things I would do. I would change these here. I would extract these to be constants. So I'm going to extract here. Let's introduce a local variable. Sure, we'll start with that. Yep. That's not what I wanted. Get out of that. So I'm going to put in a private static final, and we're going to call it a string, and I'm going to make it, let's name it something like panel pref name. Name, sure, why not? And num installed, or anything that I want to describe it as. And then down here, I'm going to, instead of referring that, I'm going to do this because I'm using that string twice, and it's an arbitrary string. So if someone later comes along and tries to change it in one spot, I want my entire code base to fix it. Likewise, I want to say here, private, I'll move these up in a second, static final string, and let's call this one prefs name equals app prefs. Again, another completely arbitrary string. So I'll make it a named constant in my code. I don't need to put this in my XML file because this is not something I need to internationalize. Nobody will ever see this unless they happen to look at my actual saved shared preferences. So I'll put that into here so I then have it stored in my system. And I can do some other housekeeping like get rid of a few toasts. But let's just prove this is all working now. Come back here, it loads up, it's got my default value, I go to show options, and it's already selected my 25, which is my default. If I change that and then say kill the program, I'm going to just do it with this. Going back here, I can now come into here, and it's got whatever I've selected. Okay, thank you very much for watching.